Warami Midiga. Hello friends. Budgerina Junya Dharug Nurawa. Good to see you on Dharug country. Welcome to 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin's audio walk at Swallow Rock Reach. Naya Giyara Rhiannon. My name's Rhiannon. Naya Dharug Burrabarungal Nurugu. I belong to the Burrabarungal clan of the Dharug people. Bayaju Gulbanga Gununigang Yura Gurugau Yagu Barabugu Dharug Yura. I pay respects to my elders, past, present and emerging. Naya Warami Inyini Dharug Nurugu. I welcome you to Dharug country. Yanawiju Manuiwa Muru Gurangadj. Walk with me in the footsteps of our ancestors. Naraji Dabuwamili Dyarubbin Gu. Listen to the story of our Dyarubbin. This river is our ancestor, a living, breathing being, sung into existence from creation. In Dharug Dalang, our language, we have names of places along the river that speak of her body, like Narungarai, little leg, and Goodbye, arm, Maramara, fingers, Garganyang, big mouth, and Milang, eyes. The river holds our dreaming, creation stories and songlines, a sacred highway connecting us across countries and nations. Remember, Midiga, tread softly on this dreaming. We are strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.
Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander listeners are advised that this audio walk contains stories of historical violence and Aboriginal people now resting in the dreaming. Listen and enjoy the stories, but please do not reproduce them in any way. Thank you.
Come, Yanma Danawi Budjuri Bumada. Walk with me in good spirit as we head down the path to the river and listen to the stories of this place. Here at Swallow Rock Reach Walking Trail, we're in one of the last remnant pockets of what our people called Daga Daga, river flat forest. The once mighty river flat forest was abundant along Dyarubbin's banks, before being largely cleared by Europeans to make way for grazing and cropping. Looking up at the tall eucalypts that surround us, you get a sense of what once covered the river's banks, growing up to 25 metres tall. The dominant tree species include forest red gum, angophora, cabbage gum, mountain blue gum, narrow-leaved ironbark and grey gum, and include many rainforest-like species. This was noted on the first exploratory trip up the river in 1789, where Governor Phillip and Hunter met with some Dharug people just a kilometre downstream and over the river at Little Cat-Eye Creek. On our way to the beach, you'll see a pedestrian bridge over to the right. We won't go that way yet. Instead, we'll continue down the left path going all the way to the beach. Emeritus Professor of History at the University of New South Wales and author of People of the River, Grace Karskens.
They would have come up from Broken Bay, those massive cliffs, and going further and further up the reaches, and it's very windy. And of course, what they're looking for is farmland. As they come up the river, they start to see river flats. The other thing that would have made it very mysterious are these amazing tall river flat forests. They have very tall trees and they are very dense and viney. So this is a sort of river flat forest that grows on most of the margins of rivers on the east coast of Australia because the soil is very rich. But there's other things that they notice. The banks, the lowlands were all churned up and they knew it was yams. It was women digging for yams on the river. And as we now know, the yams were the staple food of the Dharug people on the river. What they also found were lots of traps by the lagoons. There were holes dug and just lightly covered over with grass and shrubs, they think to trap animals. And then there were really fancy eel traps and bird traps. very beautifully made and disguised with feathers and very sophisticated methods for catching food, basically. And the food was just abundant. Not only yams, but the lagoons on the river are just chock full of waterfowl, ducks, swans. So it's like a paradise.
Local historian and author of Hawkesbury Settlement Revealed, Jan Barclay-Jack.
And it wasn't till Little Cat-Eye Creek, quite a way up the river, that the first two confident Aboriginal people came down to meet them in the boats. There was just patience and courtesy in trying to understand each other, and they did that through gifts. A ball of string made out of hair and a spear, which Philip refused to accept because he knew they needed the spear for their existence. And in return, the Europeans gave them a hatchet and they'd shot a duck, and they gave them the duck. There was real keenness in that first meeting, but that was all there was. Then they just rode on.
Just a kilometre or so upstream at Cat-Eye, or to our right, the river begins to leave her rich alluvial floodplains around Pitt-Town and Wilberforce and re-enter sandstone country at Cat-Eye. Here at Ebenezer, we can see some rock walls emerging on the river's banks, which rise gradually from Cat-Eye into what is known as the Sackville Gorge. When you get to the beach, have a wander. Look out for the rocks that you can see to the left. Geologist and author of Wasteland, Wilderness, Wonderland, Gil Jones.
If you're travelling downstream from Windsor, before you get to Cat-Eye, you've no longer got flat alluvial banks, as you say, have at Windsor. Suddenly you see low cliffs of sandstone starting to appear along the edges of the river. Sandstone cliffs are progressively increasing height as you travel to Wiseman's Ferry. A river like the Hawkesbury, and we should talk about the Hawkesbury system, it is a very ancient river system. The bowing that created the Sydney Basin as much as 100 million years ago, with these gentle inward dips of the sandstone, was going on at the same time as the river was flowing. So what seems to be the impossible occurs, that at places the river goes from flat ground into a gorge. In the locations where it re-enters high ground, that high ground has been uplifted as the river was downcutting. And so the river has kept pace with the movements of the, in inverted commas, solid earth beneath.
For our people, this sandstone country between Cat-Eye and Sackville is a sacred area, with an abundance of sites, some of which tell of our creation. Just downstream to the left, the river bends around a peninsula with a tall sandstone ridge. On a rock platform high above the river is Gurangadj, the place where the Great Eel engraving is. Below is a deep hole in the river. Gurangadj is a significant site, connected to the dreaming story of the greater region of Gurangadj, the giant shape-shifting eel being. Our people would have tended this site with care, visiting often, conducting ceremonies and looking after it like a temple or church. Today, however, this site is on a private property and no longer accessible to us. Dharug knowledge holders, educators and artists, Leanne Watson, Erin Wilkins and Jasmine Seymour.
I've always known the Gurangadj Merrigan story from where they rested at Bent's Basin. I was always told that it was a Gundungara story. The whole story is about the friction between them, and that friction is what's caused the movement of the earth and the creation. Gurangadj was explained to me as a rainbow serpent, and the rainbow serpent is the creator of the waterways on Dharug country. But in reading a lot of the engraving sites and the stories in there, I think it's actually a giant shape-forming eel.
It's a continuation of a story that happens down the south coast through Warmbien, Caves, Janolan, comes back through Bants Basin and crosses over into Dharug.
We know the Gundungurra story of Gurangadj, where he is chased through the Blue Mountains by Mirigan, and that story ends abruptly, I feel. It's in Lake Burragorang because it's a songline. Where does it go then? That's where all the rivers start to go into the Hawkesbury.
Aboriginal stories, they're not just in one place, they're connected all over. I think with colonisation, the Dharug lost quite a bit of their cultural stories. My grandmother's mother and father would have known the stories, but they wouldn't pass them on to the children because at that time we still had the black cars trying to take the children, and so the stories weren't passed on in that generation. In recent years, it's been discussed with the Gundungurra how the story connects to the Dharug, and that the Gurangadj is our creation and the creation of the Hawkesbury River. We've actually seen quite a lot of the engravings in the area that hold the stories, and it is the eel-like figure. Our stories, and I've known for a long time now, they're still here. They're in the landscape. It's just spending the time looking and piecing things back together.
So you have the big, long journeys, of course, the songlines, but then you have your section of songline and what that means to the people of that place. And so for us, along the Hawkesbury River, the Dyarubbin, we know that there are multiple sites of enormous eel engravings and words that mean eyes and legs and arms and throat and mouth. And so this river becomes this huge living entity that has created country. And many of the engravings are also maps of the river.
After a few more reconnaissance trips to the river, the British government assumed ownership of our country without any negotiation with our people, and in 1794, a group of mostly ex-convicts started to clear and farm land along the river near Bulga Hill Camp, now known as Windsor.
In 1794, things start to take a turn for what we would have to call an invasion. From an Aboriginal point of view, you can't describe it any other way. A band of about 20 people, they go to what is now called Pit Town Bottoms, and they start clearing patches of land, spread themselves along that reach, and start putting in wheat and corn. It soon became pretty obvious that you didn't have to work as hard on a farm on the river as you did in some of the other areas. Word got out in the community and more people. It's the first land rush, 400 within a few months. Can you imagine the impact on the local landscapes, the paths that you're using, your ceremonial sites? Everything would have been more and more disrupted. It's not only the taking of land, it's also because they broke all kinds of moral laws. They stole women and raped them. They stole Aboriginal children, mostly babies and toddlers. And that's the worst grief ever. And I think it's been underestimated in historical accounts. Some settlers share their corn with Aboriginal people. They don't want to get speared. They don't want their house to get burnt down. Other people shoot at them. But then slowly there's this realisation that these people are here to stay and they're not shifting. And that would have been a horrifying realisation, and that's when you get acts of war as well as law.
Our people fought back. One of our most successful strategies was to raid farms on the outer reaches of the settlement. In 1795, the outlying farms were just upstream of here at Cat on Canning Reach. Thomas Webb's farm was raided and he was speared. Joseph Wilson and his worker William Thorpe were also killed by Dharug warriors in May 1795. Following similar raids and attacks, colonisers just downstream of here at Portland Head abandoned their farms in 1797.
The warriors actually drove the settlers out. Attacks were so fierce. Partly it was effective because the riverbanks there are very narrow, and settlers were just like sitting ducks. They couldn't defend themselves and they had to leave to save their own lives. And even Governor Hunter went up there in a boat and said, we can't put more settlers here, it's way too dangerous. You often hear the story that the white people came and wiped out all the Aboriginal people. Well, the story of resistance is very important. And this story happens to be at the place where the big eel is. It happens to be where the river re-enters the ranges. There is a connection there. This is a very spiritually powerful place. This is where Gurangadj, the giant eel, started to burrow through the rock. This is the great eel that created this amazing, powerful landscape. His power is in that rock there. I'm sure that's why that was the place they thought, we're not coming in here. This is our spiritual place.
In 1803, a second wave of colonisers arrived on this stretch of the river. Free settlers who arrived together on the ship the Coromandel. Local historian Ted Brill was the principal of Ebenezer Public School from 1972 till 2000 and is an active member of the Ebenezer and church community.
There are 8 families who, back in England, decided to migrate together. 2 of those were Scots, Turnbull and Mean. A group from the Northumberland area near the Scottish border, the Halls, the Davisons and the Johnsons. But all those families were living and working in London, and they made up their mind to migrate to New South Wales. They came out in 1802 from the one ship, the Coromandel, and they moved out here at the beginning of 1803.
The Coromandel settlers had all worshipped at a Scottish Presbyterian church in London and were nonconformists to the Church of England. Emigration would provide them with the social, religious and legal freedoms they did not have in England. They would receive free passage, a land grant of 100 acres, tools and clothing, with 2 convict labourers and their food and supplies provided for a year from their arrival. George Hall brought the group of settlers together in England. It was he who surveyed the river and decided this area possessed
a particular attraction for the better class of settlers, such as retired military men and free immigrants. George Hall.
Perhaps this was due to the presence of nearby neighbours, such as the well-esteemed magistrate Thomas Arndell and boat builder John Grono, who had received land grants just upstream. It's said that on their arrival here in autumn 1803, the Coromandel settlers climbed the hill behind us, up to where the old tree still stands, and gave thanks to God. They called the hill Ebenezer Mount, and the area became known as Ebenezer, meaning stone of help.
As they settled here, 7 other families settled also, so they got 15 families. And Thomas Arndell across the river was here already. And he was highly regarded as a magistrate. He's a very strong supporter of the small settler. Well, they called this hill Ebenezer Mount. They met here and originally worshipped on this property in the shade of the tree across the road. They did that till 1809 when they built the church. They were led in worship by James Mean. He wasn't an ordained minister. They called him Pastor Mean. Before he came out here, he was given the authority by the Scottish Church to marry and to baptise.
For himself, Hall took the land around Little Cat-Eye Creek, just over the river and downstream. The place we're standing on had been granted to Owen Kavanagh in 1799. He would donate part of this grant to the church. It's possible that this beach, they called the Landing Beach, may have been the reason for this place being chosen as the Coromandel group's meeting place and eventual site for the Ebenezer Church and school. It was a safe landing place for families travelling the river by boat to reach the church, and for children to get to school. This part of the river was sacred to our people. Colonisation often took over existing places and rituals.
The children would come to school here and be dropped off down here and walk up. So there's no spot below the church up there that they can get out of a boat and go in.
The story of funeral processions was a really impressive ceremony. So you had a procession of boats along the river. And the leading boat was rowed by 4 stalwart rowers towing a second boat, and there's a coffin in that boat. As they moved along the river, people rowed out from their properties and joined the procession. And they rowed to that little beach in the reserve, and that's where they left their boats. I've stood on that beach on a day like today, and you can't see anyone, you can't hear anything other than birds. Imagine standing on that beach and you think you hear a sound. The leading rowers had muffled oars, so they're coming very quietly. You think you hear a sound, and then you see this procession coming around. There's a line of boats that carry the coffin up to the cemetery near the church for burial and have a service.
Boat builder John Grono arrived on the river in 1798 and was granted land just upstream on Canning Reach in 1801. There he built large ocean-going sealing and whaling ships. The last funeral procession on the river was Grono descendant William Grono in 1937.
William Grono must have thought so much about this place and its history that he wanted his funeral conducted the same way. It was a motorised boat pulling a second boat with a coffin in it, but they came into that beach and brought them up here the same way. When researching that, I actually found two men, they were about 89 and 90 years of age, who lived on Grono's whole property, and they remember as children coming to that funeral.
Let's leave the beach now and walk back up to the pedestrian bridge across the intermittent creek. At the time of releasing this audio walk in December 2023, the two pedestrian bridges and Swallow Rock Reach walking trail are closed, having sustained damage from major flooding in 2021 and 2022. The bridges and track are scheduled for repair in 2024. Please proceed with caution and consider your safety if the bridges or track look unsafe. If the bridge is open, let's cross the bridge and proceed along the walking trail. If the bridge is closed, we'll head back into the car park and walk up the road towards the church grounds, where you are welcome to walk down to the river or take a seat in the garden. Before we leave the bridge, look up to the right of the creek. Through the bush here, a lagoon once sat above the river. Our people called the lagoon Dharug, meaning cabbage palm. This lagoon's name was one of 178 Dharug names along the river recorded by Reverend John McGarvey in 1829. McGarvey was the first ordained minister of Ebenezer Church and also a Scot. He made at least 8 journeys overland along Dyarubbin and Gurangadj, the Macdonald River. Dharug guides gave him the names he wrote down. Historian Grace Karskens came across the list while reading in McGarvey's diary in 2017.
All along Dyarubbin, on both sides of the river, there are many, many lagoons still today. But 200 years ago, there were many more. They stretched like a necklace of mirrors right along the banks of the river. They're actually really ancient bodies of water because they're the water left behind in the swales after the river slowed and narrowed and deepened over millennia. And then, of course, they become really ecologically rich places. Lots of food plants, bird life and water creatures, eels, fish. And so, of course, they are also people magnets. They are the places where Aboriginal people, right up and down the east coast of Australia, it's where they gathered and where they camped, where they harvested and fished. They would have been good places for many people to come together.
Tall, graceful Dharug cabbage palms did grow along Dyarubbin. Our people often named places for seasonal resources that could be found there. Strips of leaves from Dharug were used to weave baskets, while the fibrous leaf base was excellent for making fires. This lagoon has now disappeared, though in 1994 an archaeologist recording sites in this area noted an old lagoon with 2 rock shelters overlooking it here. This was likely Dharug. Dharug artist Leanne Mulgo-Watson.
The lagoons, I've always thought they're really important because to me they're full of medicine and resources, and they sort of stand out to me as women's places. And I love how the language it's brought back, connection that we have to those places.
The creek that sometimes flows under the bridge today drains another of our named lagoons, Gurangadj, a double-necked lagoon. As we reach the top of the first set of stairs on the walking trail, a cleared paddock will open up to our right and in this paddock is Gurangadj, a long, narrow lagoon which once had 2 creeks flowing from it. If you haven't already, head off either over the bridge and along the walking trail or back to the car park, then up the road towards the church grounds.
The Mugabe list names 25 lagoons, from Mari Mari in Richmond right down to Baroma, which was a once vast lagoon and wetland down at Sackville. A lot of them tell us something about the country, so they might be named for birds, like Biruma or Birama is a reference to the ducks that no doubt lived there. And there are even different names related to the word for lagoon: Warecha, Warang, Warade, Warakia, which seem to describe the kind of lagoons that they were. So a double lagoon, a large lagoon, a long lagoon.
Looking across the river from here, we are opposite the 600 acres granted to Surgeon Thomas Arndell, which was passed down through generations of the Arndell family, till in the 1980s it was sold to the New South Wales government and became Cat-Eye National Park. Across the river from us here was known as Hope Farm. When we reach the fenced lookout with the bench seat, we'll stop here for a while and look out over the river. According to locals, Swallow Rock, after which this reach or straight section of the river is named, is the rock under this lookout, named for the swallows that live under it. Arndell named his property Caddy, which is likely an Aboriginal name he borrowed from the coastal Dharug people, the Gadigal. Mugabe recorded our name, Bulbura, near Arndell's home, meaning soft corkwood, a rainforest tree which likely once grew there, probably used as a resource by our people. Michael Kemp is a descendant of ex-convict Peter Kemp and the Stubbs and Arndell families, and lives on the river opposite the original Stubbs grant.
Where the church walk is, that lookout, that's the Swallow Rock underneath you. Directly opposite Swallow Rock, that whole point is Hope Farm. So my great-grandfather, he got a lease there, it's Hope Farm. There were 100 acres and planted all the citrus and farmed it for about 40 years, I think, because Arndell is actually my 6 times great-grandfather. My grandfather, Charles Kemp, would walk from the house just on Tazana Road, down past the church, put his lunch on his head and swim across the river to work on the farm.
John Howe was another of the Coromandel settlers to arrive on the Hawkesbury in 1802. His 100 acres was just downstream of the church on this side. Howe would go on to become a businessman and constable in Windsor. In 1819 and 1820, guided by Aboriginal people, Howe would discover the way to the Hunter Valley via today's Putty Road, for which Governor Macquarie rewarded him with a 700-acre grant in the Hunter. But here on Swallow Rock Reach in 1804, Dharug warriors speared John Howe and his servant. Just downriver at Portland Head, Matthew and Elizabeth Everingham and their servant were also speared. The spear wounds were not fatal, Dharug warriors likely delivering a warning. Howe was just over the river from the Great Eel engraving, which was on the 100 acres granted to William Stubbs in 1803, another of the Coromandel arrivals.
That particular land was taken from Dharug people by the Stubbs family in 1803, and in 1805, warriors determinedly kept attacking that particular farm. At least 4 times in a row. They waited till William Stubbs was away, and then they would raid the property, take all the family's possessions and all their food. It seems that the Stubbs knew the local Aboriginal people. They probably knew these attackers, because at one point the warriors said to Sarah Stubbs that she and her children would not be harmed. And that's what happened. They weren't harmed. The 4th time, William Stubbs had had enough. He got into an Aboriginal canoe with one of his convict servants, rowed over to the other side, went up into the mountains and tried to get his property back. He wasn't successful, and on the way back, the canoe overturned in the river, and the servant survived by clinging to its bark sides, but William Stubbs tried to swim to shore, he became entangled in the water weeds and reeds at the side of the river, and he drowned. Why did they attack that property so often? When we look at the archaeology, it seems that this would have been a sacred site for Dharug people. There are small shelters with hand stencils, which usually shows that these places were places of pilgrimage where you left a mark of your hand. There are many axe grinding grooves on the sandstone platform. So it seems that the power of the rocks was being taken into the axes as they were sharpened. And the eel itself is connected, without a doubt, to the most famous creation story in the Sydney region, and that is the story of Gurangadj, which is a story from the Gurangadj people who are just in the mountains to the south of this area. And there are lots of other clues in this landscape of the presence of this ancestral creator being, this giant eel, apart from the engraving itself. Just below are some very deep meanders in the river as it rounds the headland, cliffs which show Gurangadj's path through the river as he tore up country. There's a double sheer cliff, which on McGarvey's list is noted as Yirangbulla. And below that is one of the deepest holes in the river. It's up to 40 metres deep. Gurangadj creates deep river holes and they become his resting places, and sometimes he goes deeper and comes up somewhere else in the river. Further downriver there is a place called Milogurua, meaning place of eye in deep water. Another really striking echo of the Gurangadj story, because the hunter Mirigan first finds Gurangadj in a waterhole when he glimpses his eye, which shone like a star through the water. Altogether, Yirangbulla, Milogurua and Garia are really telling us that this is a sacred zone, and maybe there is a link there with the way the Stubbs family was so determinedly and repeatedly attacked.
Nearly 200 years later, in 1999, sixth generation descendant of William Stubbs, the late Dr. Rex Stubbs, then Mayor of Hawkesbury City Council, made the first official apology to Aboriginal people in the Hawkesbury, at the opening of a memorial on the river in Macquarie Park, Freeman's Reach. A rock engraving there, created by my grandmother Auntie Edna Watson and her sisters, marks the first meeting of our ancestor Yarramundi with Governor Phillip on the river in 1791. Back here at Ebenezer in 1805, across the river from Stubbs and Garia, was the 100-acre grant of John Turnbull, another of the Coromandel colonists.
My name is Rebecca Turnbull, and I am 8th generation descendant from John Turnbull, who was a free settler who came out in 1802 on the Coromandel. When he came out, he was already in his mid-50s. When they got off the ship, they were greeted by Governor King, who said to him, "One foot in the grave, one out of it. What brings you here, old man?" In the 1800s, being in your mid-50s was middle to late age. And interestingly, he outlived Governor King and died in his mid-90s. John Turnbull, he was probably one of the last ones to pick land at what they called in those days Portland Head, which we now know as Ebenezer. They went down the river in a boat. Government official who was with them said, "This is where so-and-so lives. This land is available here. When we go around the bend, there's that one there." So they selected their grants. And he, I think, took his time. Just didn't select what was flat and easy and fertile. He picked land on ahead with a large rocky outcrop and actually built his house on this rocky outcrop. Had the farm down the bottom, which would have been more labour intensive in terms of getting water and things like that. But it also meant that he was one of the only ones who survived floods. The biggest and the most shocking for them would have been the 1806 flood. It was a high flood, and it would have been the first one since they lived there. They saw crops washed away, livestock washed away, people washed away. There wasn't many boats to rescue people. Lots of stories about sitting on barns and houses and hoping to be rescued. And Thomas Arndell was very instrumental during that 1806 flood, assisting people and then advocating for them later on. Anne Turnbull was 7 or 8 months pregnant at the time too, which would have been pretty scary. Again, though, they took in a lot of their neighbours and looked after them because their houses had been inundated by floodwaters. John Turnbull was known for peaches and pigs, as well as the usual wheat, maize that everybody grew. Pigs are fast breeding and fast growing, something to take to market, to sell, which of course they would have taken by boat. What was the benefit of the 8 families that travelled out together on the Coromandel, who then came to Portland Head and all had properties adjoining each other or near each other and opposite each other? What a wonderful support network that would have been on the river, to just have people that they knew, someone to help them in times of need or in childbirth or sickness. They created their own little community there on the river, whereas many other early settlers were very, very isolated. William Stubbs was going over to the Turnbull property across the river when he got caught in the reeds and drowned, while his wife was the one who was taking the 8-hour round trip to Parramatta. She was making that trip alone on horseback to get supplies.
Getting back to those connections of the 8 families, besides coming from similar areas, John Turnbull worked with William Stubbs as a weaver in the same firm. And they came out together, and when they came here and they selected their blocks of land, Stubbs selected his opposite Turnbull because they were friends. It's interesting, 150 years later, a Turnbull descendant met a Stubbs descendant and married, had a son called Malcolm, and he became our Prime Minister. That's amazing. Yeah.
Let's continue now on our walk to the next lookout, where you'll see a similar stone and wooden bench. We'll stop a while there. Some of the settlers had a seine fishing net between them, which hung vertically in the water with its bottom edge held down by weights and its top edge buoyed by floats. Fish were plentiful, and the seine would have likely netted them an abundance of perch and mullet on a calm night. In 1804, Governor King ordered that all boats on the river after dark were to be seized. This was to remove from convicts and thieves a means of escape by the river. Net fishing was prohibited on the river here, but farmers considered the fish theirs by right, because in the early surveys, the centre of the river was the boundary between grants. So farmers each owned half the river along their boundary, and in their minds, half the fish. Farmers also cleared the yam beds our people cultivated along the riverbanks. Dharug educator Erin Wilkins.
So the waterways give us our food, give us our livelihood. I made a transporting canoe. Everyday life was centralised around the river life for a lot of our people. We used to have a lot of our tool making workshops along the river or the creek lines. The Hawkesbury Nepean had an abundance of yams, and they were a staple diet found along quite rich, fertile soil of the riverbanks. The way that we obtained our food was always in the thought of not to be greedy, not to take in excess, and to always leave it for future days ahead. So you only take what you needed at that point in time, and then you let it sit. We cultivated in a sense that we were respectful to the food source, respectful to Mother Earth. A lot of the water birds or waterfowl on the river, the men would come down with their boomerangs, and the boomerangs would be thrown in multiples high up to the sky in front of the sun to cast a shadow while there's plenty of waterfowl in the water. So they'd throw the boomerangs up, and as it passes the sun, it casts a shadow, and the wingspan would kind of resemble the wingspan of eaglehawk. The noise of The boomerang returning is like a noise. Again, imitation of the flapping of an eagle hawk's wings. Be not as a hunting mechanism, it'd be a herding mechanism, pushing the ducks or the water birds along the river line and heading them into the bird nets that have been woven, massive metres by metres, that they'd string up in trees across the river lines.
Another reason that our warriors attacked settlers and their farms was over the taking of our women without tribal permission. Our women gave birth to a generation of mixed descent children, and punishment, sometimes death, was inflicted on settlers who broke our laws. A child of one such union was Betty Cox, born around 1804 over the river in the Cat-Eye area. Her father was likely the ex-convict George Cox, who was renting a small farm on the Stubbs property in 1806, and may have been assigned to him before that. Betty Cox was one of the Aboriginal children to enter Macquarie's native institution in Parramatta in 1816, a school and home designed to instill European values like civilisation, progress and Christianity into Aboriginal people and turn them into industrious workers. Betty left the school in 1821 and married Eastern Creek Aboriginal man Johnny Warrawendi. They raised their children at the Blacktown. As well as the 100 acres George Hall was granted just downstream beyond Little Cat-Eye Creek, in 1810 Hall purchased 100 acres at Pitttown, still known as Percy's Place on Hall's Point, and would later purchase more land in the area for his children. In the 1820s and 30s, he and his sons drove their cattle up into Gamilaroi country and further north. For this he received a further 6,000 acres of land grants in the Hunter Valley. For Aboriginal people, this land, our country, is not something to be bought and sold. It is something that we belong to. But with colonisation came war, shutting us out from our pathways, resources and ceremonial grounds. Our traditional land was taken, and the monetary wealth gained from the selling of our country is not something that Aboriginal people have inherited. This wealth remains out of reach for many Aboriginal people today. Just beyond the second lookout, part of the riverbank was eroded heavily in major flooding in 2021 and 2022, washing away a section of the walking trail. As you walk on from the second lookout, if repairs are not yet complete, you will need to turn back. However, if this section of track has now been repaired, we'll continue on to the second bridge and to the place which was once Ebenezer Wharf, where cargo boats, passenger boats and grocery boats would stop to collect passengers and produce. Today, you can see a number of water pumps extracting water from the river for local farms. We'll stop at the end of the trail for a while. Harold Hall, born in 1917, was a descendant of George Hall and was interviewed in 1992 by historian Sue Rosen, author of Losing Ground, an environmental history of the Hawkesbury Nepean catchment.
Well, my father lived in the old church house right on the river, just down here. We've lived around the river all our life. We used to go for picnics on the river when I was a boy, 7 or 8 years old. Beautiful. We used to go from the Ebenezer Wharf down to Wiseman's Ferry, have a picnic lunch down there and then come back again on the old Gurangadj. In those days, you could come right up here to the Ebenezer Wharf with no trouble at all. She was a cargo boat, really.
What did the water look like?
Beautiful. Clear as crystal. You could see 10 feet down into the water. All the produce produced in the Hawkesbury at that stage went by cargo boat. And there was a tremendous amount of produce produced in the Hawkesbury at that stage. It's gradually died out. Well, mainly then in those days it was stone fruit and citrus. It transferred from boat sea to trucks. And vegetables took over then, where irrigation plants and all that kind of thing was installed. And everything was grown under irrigation.
Born in 1888, Wald Jones was the captain of the Livingston and the Surprise II. two of the passenger and cargo boats that plied the river between 1910 and the late 1960s. He was interviewed in 1984 for the On the Record project for Hawkesbury Library Service.
I started in 1910 with the Livingston. Well, I ran her up until 1924. I built the Surprise then. She was a 60-foot overall. She'd carry 50 tons. All kinds of fruit, vegetables, pigs, poultry, anything that's come off a farm. And then they started to grow beans and peas and tomatoes and stone fruit. We had a 22-foot gangway plank I did on the Surprise and the Livingston. Well, some people had walls, but most of them you just had to push in alongside the river bank and throw this plank out. Then you had to run out that, perhaps go another 10 feet up the bank, pick up the fruit, then back in again. Now, that's how we got it on. You just navigated by the hills. Fogs, well, if it's a very heavy fog, well, you'd have to stop. Didn't matter how dark or rainy a night was, it never stopped me from getting up that river. I never watched the water. I looked at the top of the hills. That's how I see it. I'd done a good many trips. Box a day, I'd run down to the races at Wiseman's Ferry. Then the picnics, like the New Year's Day, go down to North Portland. They always had a team meeting on New Year's Day. And Easter, there was another team meeting up at Sackville. When all the motor cars had come about, you couldn't get anybody to go on the boats. The Livingston was the one I carried the most passengers on to. Down to Wiseman's and back, as a return trip for $1. She'd be packed, you know, you'd be standing up on it. There'd be over 100 on it. But that's £5 I'd get. That was good money in them days.
The steamer, Hawkesbury, will run from Ebenezer to Wiseman's Ferry on Boxing Day in connection with the sports at the ferry. The steamer will leave Bennett's Wharf at 7 a.m. and Sackville Wharf at 8:15 a.m. Windsor and Richmond Gazette, 1909.
The Hawkesbury, she was the first steamboat on the river. She started to run in 1887. Hadn't run more than about 5 or 6 years. And she got burnt up at Ebenezer, Bennett's Wharf.
Bennett's Wharf, yeah.
Then she got burnt to the waterline.
Bennett's Wharf at Ebenezer was downstream near the original Turnbull property on Portland Head. Fire would later largely destroy the steamship the Hawkesbury, further down the river, and her mast and compass are on display at Hawkesbury Regional Museum in Windsor. Harold Hall, born in 1917, was a descendant of George Hall and was interviewed in 1992 by historian Sue Rosen.
Fish was plentiful in those days, tons of mullet, perch mainly, silver perch. We used to have a drift net and we'd go out of a night time and catch a feed of fish, might get 30, 40 fish, beautiful fish. About 3-pounders. You couldn't eat a fish in the Hawkesbury now between Nepean and Wiseman's Ferry. European carp was introduced somewhere along the line and they're taking over up here now, 30 and 40 pound in weight. But they ruin the river for the rest of the fish. You see an occasional turtle now. There's nothing to see the platypus out on the bank. I've caught them in the net and had to release them out of the net. Well, I'd say they're gradually diminishing, but they're still there, coming more into the dams and the waterholes. Well, it's getting shallower all the time, and you can put this down to floods, I'd say. In a big flood, the flood will come up and stay for about 3 or 4 days, and then it'll suddenly drop. But as soon as the water goes down, the water soaks out of the bank again, say up to a week later, and away goes the bank, straight into the river. I belong to the State Emergency Service, and we launched a boat down here on my old place. We had to go down river to check on 2 or 3 places that were isolated, 7 or 8 years ago. We just backed the car onto the riverbank and launched the boat off the top of the riverbank. When we came back, we pulled it out the same way. And I went down the next morning and there was at least half an acre of ground gone from where we launched the boat.
Have you noticed changes in the water quality?
Absolutely. You can't drink it, you can smell it. When you can imagine that there's about 28 or something septic treatment works comes into the Hawkesbury, you can imagine what it's like. And that it's all the way down the river. I wouldn't like to go for a swim in it now. I had a wharf down there and you could stand on the edge of the wharf and you could see 10, 12 feet right down to the bottom. Clear, crystal clear. It's a dull, muddy looking look now. Never clears up properly. 10 to 15 years ago, you could see it gradually changing. I think the water board has got to get their priorities right and start to eliminate the sewerage that comes into the river. That's what's killing our waterways. There's nothing surer than that.
What was your occupation?
Citrus grass.
Right, and then you had the ski garden.
I had the ski garden. Well, the floods wiped me out. What the flood didn't do in damage, like washing eroded. When the flood had gone down, the effluent in the water caused the trees to rot around the ground level. And it was that bad at that particular time that where the water came up to on the big trees, which is 4 feet high, every leaf on the tree rotted and went brown. Well, I had to pull all the orchard out, level it all off and go in and see if I could make something out of a picnic ground. So it was successful, but a lot of people have got the idea that the ski boats contributed to the erosion of the bank. They didn't in any way. You get these boats now on the river and they're riding on top of the water. They don't even make a ripple when the boat goes past and it hits the shore.
The water ski park, Kallawatta, once Harold Hall's property, is beyond Ebenezer Church at the end of Coromandel Road. Following floods in the 1960s, many nearby properties began to open their grounds for water skiing. Athol Kemp, descended from ex-convict Peter Kemp, was interviewed by historian Sue Rosen in the 1990s.
So yes, I fished the river in the water skied on. I've watched the changes take place. This is Upper Crescent Reach, but I'm watching the erosion take place either side of me. I thought this one for a long time, it didn't get very far, and the influence of boating on the river, water skiing, man introduced this recreation, which is a lovely recreation, certainly, but the upper reaches of the river is not suitable for it. It's actually predisposing the banks to the ravage of a flood, in other words, making flood damage worse, and it doesn't allow natural restoration to take place. In the past, before water skiing reached saturation, a major flood would certainly do some damage. You get subsidence and what have you, but smaller floods, minor floods, would build up the toe of the bank. Vegetation would come through and it would restore itself, you know. But that doesn't happen anymore. The speedboats are on the river as soon as the flood's down the next weekend. And that weekend, you'll see the erosion taking place, all this sand sliding into the river. So where the toe of the bank used to be built up with minor floods, it doesn't happen anymore. It's quickly eroded away. The roots of the trees are all exposed to the ravage of the next flood that comes down. And the damage that the major floods do is they're exposed for the next flood to tear more away, you know. But they don't seem to understand that the man's upset the balance, nature's balance on the river, with all these boats rearing up and down, and there's continual wave action every weekend. That's predisposing our banks. And since 61, that's what, 30 years, it'll be about 15 feet.
It's just gone into the river.
Yeah.
Associate Professor of Environmental Science at Western Sydney University, Rhiannon Wright.
Oh, this river is an absolute environmental treasure of southeastern Australia. Sydney, it's absolutely loved, but there is no coordinated management whatsoever to look after the values that people love. It's an absolute disaster of management in my mind. So I know that the Sydney Water test because they discharge a lot of sewage wastes into the river, so they're required to, as part of their environmental licence that they have with the EPA, and also Water New South Wales test. So both those authorities test. Sometimes we can get their data, but it's not generally publicly available. Last week when we tested this, the nutrient levels were so high, I know that a factor in that was actually the sewage level in the river. So it depends, safe. It depends what your purpose is for the river. If you want to preserve the ecosystem, it's not safe at all. And in terms of bacteria and blue-green algae is one of the big health problems here. Not safe at all from time to time. When you get high nutrients and it's warm and lots of sunlight, and sometimes the river can provide just the perfect conditions. So they have had blue-green blooms going down 20 or more kilometres of the river. And in fairness to the Sydney water in particular, they have improved their sewage treatment. So they've reduced the level of nutrient in their effluent. But they've got probably hundreds of thousands of more people. So if you have more flushing toilets, even if you reduce those levels, the volumes are going up, so the river cops it. I don't think we should be discharging our effluent to the river. We're using the river as a giant flushing toilet. I could list about 25, I think, sewage treatment plants. I mean, this is the Hawkesbury River. All the tributaries of this provide Sydney with about 98% of our drinking water. Warragamba's one, Avon, Cataract, Cordo, Winchicaraby, it goes on and on and on. This river gives so much to us, most people don't even realise. And in return, we give it effluent and runoff. What is ironic for me is they actually make a fortune out of the river. It's over 2 billion, I think it's 2.8 billion in revenue, and part of that is the cost of sewage. They bill people for sewage, but it's also the water that we consume, and that makes a profit for the government. And the last year that I saw the annual report, the government got a bounty of something in the order of 600 million, which is basically from the river, because that's where our water supply comes from.
If you've made it to the end of the trail, beyond the second bridge and some picnic tables, you'll see a few pumps down near the river with meter boxes on poles. Properties close by have licences with the New South Wales Office of Water to pump from the river for irrigation. Turf is now one of the most popular and profitable crops grown along the river in this area, and farms pump water either from the river or from the lagoons. Along the Hawkesbury and Lower Nepean River catchment, there are over 1,500 water licences, which in 2020 and 2021 pumped over 13,000 megalitres of water from the river. If you haven't already turned back, head back in your own time to where we began. We're going to go beyond the car park and walk up the road towards Ebenezer Church.
My name is Basant Maheshwari. I work at Western Sydney University. I'm a professor working in the area of water, environment and sustainability. The river is very close to my work and my heart, because river is a live entity. It's not just a physical thing. It's the vegetation, it's the life in the river. Many people depend on the river. River is a very valuable asset for whole of Sydney. There's certain flow required to maintain the aquatic life in the river. But when you start extracting that water, then it changes what aquatic life can survive, and they come to an equilibrium. Looking at the population we expect, say by 2030, we may just have enough water for drinking, but not for other things like irrigating parks and ovals, irrigation of the crop, and so on. So we really need to reuse some of the wastewater we have and also manage stormwater properly. In an ideal situation, there is a base flow, means when river is running low, groundwater will contribute. So if there is still no rainfall and there is a good groundwater situation, groundwater will contribute to the river and there will be flow. And that's a good thing, especially during droughts. And then when we have good rains, then some of the river water will go into the groundwater system. But if we have lowered the groundwater levels of the area through irrigation, through more pumping, not enough recharge, then the contribution of groundwater to river may not be enough. If you want to manage the river and the whole water cycle in the area, we cannot ignore groundwater because it's the total water which is important.
For Dharug people, the land, the river, lagoons, creeks, rocks, the trees, plants, animals, birds, these are Nura, country. Nura is our mother. We belong to her. Nura holds our dreaming and our law. The spirit of our ancestors and the source of our language rest in Noora. Country must be cared for as we would care for our mother. That is our law, our way since the dreaming. Colonisation has not only separated and displaced families, instilling racism, fear and shame, leaving a legacy of intergenerational trauma that continues to affect our people, but has also devastated country. Country has been exploited for financial gain. The river is polluted with sewerage, pesticide runoff, rubbish, weeds and invasive species. Our riverbanks cleared, causing erosion and water extracted from the river with little thought to what will remain for the generations that will follow. Dyarubbin, this country, calls us to listen, to take better care. The geology of this part of the river impacts the way floodwaters behave here, known locally as the Sackville Bathtub. Associate Professor of Geology at the University of Sydney, Tom Hubble.
The problem with the flooding in the Sackville Bathtub, as it's known, or this part of Western Sydney, is that because of this geological history and this part of the Sydney area actually subsiding a little bit more than the surrounds, and the nature of the geometry of the rock bodies, we go from this sort of wide open shale floored area of the valley. Downstream and upstream we've got sandstone floors, much stronger and much more resistant to erosion, so that area is dominated by these gorges, and that shrinks down the width of the valley, which impedes the flow in the big floods. So we've got this big natural bathtub with a small plug hole downstream, and so when we do get really large flows, particularly if the Colo and the McDonald are flooding at the same time, that backs all that water up into this area, and that's why you can get these absolutely astounding 30, maybe even 40 metres above low flow floods, whereas the 1 in 100 year flood's about a 12 or 13, 14 metre high flood. The maximum floods in the 1867 flood, I think, was 20 metres above low flow. The calculated disaster floods are much higher still, at 30, 35. And if the Indigenous oral history supported by the flood lag evidence up in Fairlight Gorge is as accurate as I think it is, then the biggest flows that have come through here are actually bigger than the ones that we calculate. And that's a little bit terrifying. It doesn't matter how big we make the retaining wall on Warragamba, it won't control that kind of a flow in such a way that will protect the property. The deeper it gets, the faster it goes, the more damage it can potentially cause. They're in the realms of 1 in 600 or 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 year events.
As we head towards the church, local historian and former principal of Ebenezer Public School, Ted Brill, takes us back to the community of families living within about 10 kilometres of each other along the river who decided to build a church and school.
There's a lot of uncertainty in the colony, so these people formed this Portland Head Society, and that's at a meeting in September 1808 in Arndel's home. At that meeting they pledged themselves to building the church and starting a school. And each family pledged £10 towards the building of the church. That's through that Scottish influence, because the Scots were very strong on education. And you look at the early ministers who came out, they had MAs. They wanted their children educated, so they started their own school. Owen Kavanagh donated 4 acres on which to build a church. It wasn't very central, more people were downstream, but this is where they met. I suppose because Gurangadj is much further upstream, Arndel's over here in that direction, so in some ways it's central. Most of the people are from here down, but they weren't that far away.
Once we arrive back at the car park, we'll walk up the entrance roadway. About halfway up the hill on the left-hand side, there's a short cleared path at the back of a fence. From the cleared area, a narrow track on the left winds in about 5 to 10 metres to one of the quarry sites, where rock was cut to build the church. This may be overgrown, so please only wander in if you feel safe to do so.
This is where they cut the stone, and the bullocks dragged it across to the church. to the building. About 8 or 9 of these little quarries like this, going that way and going to the bottom of the hill. Each one's got a mound on that side, so that's a mound of discarded rubble. So any stones they didn't want to just throw on the side. Sometimes they'd drive a wooden wedge in there and keep wetting it. The wood would expand and gradually the rock would split. Other times they just do a series of metal wedges to the rock split away. There was no help from the government. They employed the stonemasons, they employed the carpenters. They did what they can themselves. Every family was assigned 2 convicts, so I imagine they'd take them with them when they're doing things like
this. Let's continue up the hill and cross Coromandel Road, where you can see the old tree Ted mentioned that the settlers first gathered under. It has a post and rail fence around it. Please take care as you cross the road.
So for many years the settlers gathered under that tree for worship, and sometimes in wet weather they'd be in Kavanagh's home, and sometimes across the river at Arndel's home. It'd be rather crowded because Kavanagh's home was just a timber slab building. Anyway, the tree is a forest red gum. It's been subject to 2 huge storms in my time. The first one in 1978, when it ripped the canopy off the tree. It grew a new canopy. In 2005, this freak windstorm came through and ripped the new canopy off and dropped it on the road. I thought that was the end of the historic tree, but it had a section growing out the side that became a new crown, and it's still alive today. It's got a nice canopy again. Peter Ridgway, he's an ecologist. He studies trees and he dates trees using digital techniques and old photographs over a period of time. He estimates that the tree's between 380 and 480 years old. It's the oldest confirmed age for a tree in Australia. It's certainly a remarkable tree.
Beyond the tree you can see Gurangadj, a large lagoon at the bottom of the paddocks. Gurangadj means place of quolls, small cat-like marsupials which preyed on small mammals, birds and reptiles. As we heard earlier in the Gundungara story, the tiger quoll Mirigan chases the giant eel Gurangadj across country. With this lagoon being named after quolls so close to Guria, the place of the Great Eel just downstream, it seems likely that Gurangadj is part of the continuation of that dreaming track here on Dyarubbin. For our people, this area was part of a sacred zone on the river. Dharug educators Leanne Watson, Erin Wilkins and Jasmine Seymour.
Important spot, that church,
Ebenezer.
Whenever you walk into that area, there's like artefacts all over the driveway. So there's all stone tools everywhere, and just next to it there's a rock shelter that had heaps of tools in there that was taken out.
The building of churches and government buildings was really designed to be put in those places where there's maximum occupation to displace people. That's what they did. So that makes complete sense.
They found some really special tools out there. So we went out there and they reburied them like in the garden where nobody would find them. But you can tell it's like a place of ceremony and quite a spiritual place.
Let's head over into the church grounds now, where you are welcome to wander around, before heading down to walk along the riverbank. The schoolmaster's tea house is usually open Wednesday to Sundays from 10 till 3 p.m. Our people also had a name for the school, Warragia. We think this probably meant standing up straight.
The school started the very next year after the church was built, 1810. John Yule was the teacher, and he was here for 4 years. He not only was the schoolmaster, but he also conducted the odd church service and did the odd burial service. The church was half school, half church. They had a seated petition across the middle, and there was a loft in the classroom. Some children were too far away and perhaps a bit dangerous to go home every day, so many of them stayed overnight. So it's like a little boarding school. And the girls slept up in the loft with the schoolmaster's wife, and the boys slept on the hard classroom floor. Poor teacher had them 24 hours a day. It was a church school from here in the church from 1810 up to 1886, and there was a public school just up on the hill, first hill to go up the road, and the church school closed. We've got 2 photos of that when school was up there before it burnt down in the bushfire. and there's about 48 children in the class, one teacher, children aged from 6 to 14.
Like you might go to school on a school bus, they had school boats that came in and they were only allowed supposedly to take so many kids, but they just zigzagged across the river collecting children from each side. And they were often in trouble for having had too many children on the boats. And you can imagine, the trip to school, if it's windy, is a lot harder. If it's raining, you'd get wet, so a lot of kids didn't go in the rain. From the late 1880s up until 1930s and more, 40s.
We're nearly at the end of our walk. Feel free to make your way back to the church entrance and down the hill to our starting point in your own time. Ebenezer local Michael Kemp.
Grandpa and his father planted the first trees just up the road here in the 1890s, citrus trees. And the Aborigines that lived down here that worked in the winery also worked for Grandpa. There was all little humpies all along the side of the road here. Mum remembers them even in the 60s, they were still there. All the engravings that are around here. Across the road here there's a full-size warrior with a spear and shield on private property. My father in the 1920s, I remember coming up to the top of the cliffs and there'd be 3 or 4 groups of Aborigines sitting in circles. And he remembers all engravings and tools and everything up there, and caves around here with hand paintings.
Ebenezer School has an extensive photograph collection, and it goes back to photos in the late 1890s. There's Aboriginal children, 2 eras. One's the 1920s, the Baker children, Aboriginal, and the 1930s, the Barber children. An Aboriginal by the name of Andrew Barber. He was one of the best known residents of the district. He was born about 1853 and he lived to the grand age of about 92, some say 100. One local farmer remarked that Andy could turn his hand at anything, and he always did the work of a man and a half in one day. One Ebenezer resident I knew, Harold Hall. Harold remembered his family receiving waratahs from Andy, and for festive season, big bunches of Christmas bush. Another Ebenezer lady, Sarah Younger, used to always give Andy her first cut of Christmas pudding. And she said that Andy spent his old age living just down where we are now. He spent many years camped along this bank here at Ebenezer Church, and he virtually lived on fish that he caught. And he often taught children to fish down here. He taught them how to fly a snatch. He'd teach them how to fish for mullet or perch. So there were children that remember that. And one man remembered as a boy, that Andy taught him to fish, that the boy would be fishing down near the river and somehow he'd feel Andy's presence. And sure enough, he'd turn around and there he was.
Didgerigura, thanks for your company. We hope you've enjoyed 11 stories from the River Dyarubbin Swallow Rock Reach audio walk. For more information, please see Hawkesbury Regional Museum's website. There are 10 other audio walks along Dyarubbin you can listen to. Nabawunya, see you soon. Remember Midiga, tread softly on this dreaming. This country is alive with the Gumara, spirit of our Gurangadj ancestors. We are strong here. We remain strong here. We will always be strong here.